Tendai Mwadi, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe, Kudzai Mudzimu Mokuro. We give praises unto our great ancestors, Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodie, African power and African liberation for all African people. Greetings and welcome, brothers and sisters, to another impromptu geopolitical analysis. Something did cross my purview a couple days ago, and I thought I'll bring it to you with a little bit of analysis to go with it. Let's get into the thing. So, this article reads, Banana Giant held liable for funding paramilitaries. That's a very interesting headline for your article. Banana Giant held liable for funding paramilitaries. What that mean? Giant Banana have thought and action and money to fund paramilitary. Well, brothers and sisters, it would seem by the image accompanying this story that we have a bunch of banana here, so, and when you look on the bunch of banana them, each banana have a sticker on it, and the sticker read Chiquita. Yeah, man, we know that's the name there. We know the label there. We see the label there before all over the banana them. We got you with supermarket and we market them throughout the United Kingdom of Great Britain. But what does Chiquita have to do with paramilitaries? It's Wagwan. Make we read. A court in the United States has found multinational fruit company Chiquita Brands International liable for financing a Colombian paramilitary group. Serious business are going, kings and queens. The group, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, abbreviated as the AUC, which is the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, in Spanish the abbreviation would be the AUC, was designated by the US as a terrorist organization at the time. So it looked like Chiquita did give money to the paramilitary that was not only a paramilitary, but a paramilitary designated as a terrorist by the US government. Serious business at Guam. Following a civil case brought by 8 Colombian families whose relatives were killed by the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, Chiquita has been ordered to pay $38.3 million, which is 30 million in pounds, in damages to the families. Chiquita said in a statement that it intended to appeal against the jury's verdict, arguing that there was no legal basis for the claims. So they've been charged, found guilty, but they're saying that there's no legal basis, which is very interesting. Okay, so they're going to appeal, yeah? The jury in the case, which was heard in a federal court in South Florida, found Chiquita responsible for the wrongful deaths of 8 men killed by the AUC. The AUC engaged in widespread human rights abuses in Colombia, including murdering people it suspected of links with left-wing rebels. The victims range from trade unionists to banana workers. The case was brought by the families after Chiquita pleaded guilty in 2007 to making payments to the AUC. This is getting very interesting. Not only are they going to appeal the decision, but they're going to appeal the decision after already having pled guilty to making the payments to the so-called terrorist organization. During the 2007 trial, it was revealed that Chiquita had made payments amounting to more than 1.7 million to the AUC in the 6 years from between 1997 to 2004. So this is the period of criminal activity in question, yeah, you know, concluded just about 20 years ago. Yeah, note those dates. Look, we're going to get deeper in some history in a little while, kings and queens. The banana giant. So now we know that Chiquita is in fact the banana giant. Said that it began making the payments after the leader of the AUC at the time, Carlos Castano, implied that staff and property belonging to Chiquita's subsidiary in Colombia could be harmed if the money was not forthcoming. Lawyers for Chiquita argued that the company had no choice. The poor banana giant Chiquita, them did have no choice. Had no choice but to pay the AUC to protect its Colombian employees from violence. Chiquita is so concerned about the safety of its Colombian employees that it have to pay the money to the AUC, the terrorist organization. A serious business are going. But the plaintiffs argued that the company formed an unquote unholy alliance with the AUC. At a time when Chiquita was expanding its presence in regions controlled by the AUC. The regular payments continued even after the AUC was designated by the US a foreign terrorist organization in 2001. While the AUC claimed to have been created to defend landowners from attacks and extortion attempts by left-wing rebels, the paramilitary group more often acted as a death squad for drug traffickers. Yeah. Now, brothers and sisters, look at what this article is saying about the AUC and note that nowhere in this article is the word gang used. If you've been following our coverage of the situation in Haiti, you will know exactly why I'm making that point. Because the term gang has been used all over the place to describe the paramilitary units in Haiti. But nowhere in this article is the term gang used, even though this formation, the AUC, is considered to be a terrorist formation organization that is using its paramilitary might to commit atrocities against the Colombian people. There is very little that this paramilitary is accused of that the so-called gangs in Haiti are not accused of, yet the term gang is used for the Haiti context, but not in the Colombian context for some reason. It's a very interesting dynamic. I'm just pointing that out. Make we get back to finish this article, which you can find on the BBC, brothers and sisters. At its height, it had an estimated 30,000 members who engaged in intimidation, drug trafficking, extortion, forced displacement, and killings. Again, none of these accusations are absent. The accusations levied against the formations in Haiti. But the language is very different, very interesting. But we're not going to dwell upon that something there today. It also launched brutal attacks on villagers suspected of supporting left-wing rebels. The group demobilized in 2006 after reaching a peace deal with the government, but some of its members went on to form new splinter groups which continue to be active. Note that, because that same dynamic may become very, very interesting to the extent that it might be replicated in Haiti. But let's stay tuned. The class action lawsuit against Chiquita, which ended on Monday, focused on 9 cases, which were chosen out of hundreds of claims against the banana company. The jury found that the AUC was responsible for 8 of the 9 murders examined as a part of the lawsuit. The jury also ruled that Chiquita had knowingly provided substantial assistance to the AUC to a degree sufficient to create a foreseeable risk of harm. Chiquita said in a statement released after the verdict that the situation in Colombia was, quote, tragic for so many, including those directly affected by the violence there. And our thoughts remain with them and their families. Yeah, them statement there of, empathy, what I mean, with the families that who, were killed as a result of your funding of this paramilitary group. However, that does not change our belief that there is no legal basis for these claims, it added. The company said it remained confident that its legal position would ultimately prevail. Agnieszka Friesman, one of the leading lawyers for the plaintiffs, meanwhile, praised the families she represented, saying that they had risked their lives to come forward to hold Chiquita to account, putting their faith in the United States justice system. She added that the verdict does not bring back the husbands and sons who were killed, but it sets the record straight and places accountability for funding terrorism where it belongs, at Chiquita's doorstep. Another lawyer for the Colombian families, Leslie Kroger, said that after a long 17 years against a well-funded defense, justice was finally served. A second case against Chiquita, brought by another group of plaintiffs, is due to start on 15 July. Interesting piece of article. Right there. So, and there are a number of reasons why that article is very, very interesting. Yeah, and for some context for this, make we go in a little piece of history. Yeah, because history is best qualified to reward our research, brothers and sisters, of all our efforts. History is best qualified to reward our research. So it's necessary for you to know that Chiquita begins life in 1899 as the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company begins in 1899 literally as a corporate merger between various different American-based fruit companies, that some of which also had links to places in Europe, that were trying to sustain and maintain a stronghold over and an expansion in the fruit industry, particularly in bananas, which required them, to have to basically commandeer land and transport machinery within South and Central America, particularly Central America. And so the United Fruit Company begins its operations in Guatemala, and as a result of its expansions in Guatemala, it controlled the railway, it controlled the whole of the postal service, it controlled it was the largest single landowner, in Guatemala, owning an estimated 1/5 of the entirety of the arable land in Guatemala. And it also controlled and dominated the entirety of the Guatemalan telecommunications. And a lot of that is in part due to the fact that as a result of its investments, the United Fruit Company was in fact building railways and building phone lines and so on and so forth. But they maintain ownership and control over all of these things, and the governments and the people of these nations, generally speaking, got very little to nothing out of these deals. And to a degree, to the extent that the United Fruit Company was not above. If they built a railway in a particular area and they were gonna move from that area and not use that railway again, then we'll destroy the railway, just destroy it, yeah, and go on, move on to where they go, and that's it, yeah. So that infrastructure never benefited the people in the areas that they were building, even though they were building on the people them land. And oftentimes had to commandeer land from the people in order to expand, yes, in these areas, brothers and sisters. And so from there, the United Fruit Company expands from Guatemala to Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, and many other nations and islands throughout the Americas. Yeah. Now, as I already said, in order to facilitate this expansion, they commandeered land from people, and the people in those communities became the employees of the United Fruit Company. They were paid little and nothing, and sometimes in the context of being paid nothing, they were paid with vouchers. Yeah, so they weren't paid actual money, they were paid with vouchers that they could only use, yeah, at shops owned by the United Fruit Company. And sometimes, even when they were paid with money, they could only really use that money at shops owned by the United Fruit Company. Why? Because the United Fruit Company commandeered a lot of the land. Yes, they were the biggest landowner throughout the Americas during this period. We're talking about the period from, the early 1900s right now. Yeah. They also control the housing of the people that work for them. So this is almost a complete domination of the people, them land and living conditions. In addition to owning and controlling railways, the United Fruit Company also owned and controlled a fleet of ships, which was known as the Great White Fleet. This is effectively a private navy, yeah? And not only were they able to control the transport of their products and other products between and throughout the Americas, they were also, because of this, able to dominate and control the tourism, the tourist trade, in line with the growth of their business development throughout the Americas at this point. And so they grew so powerful within South and Central America and the Caribbean that they were able effectively to commandeer the state, control the government. This is what is generally referred to as state capture. Yes, they had many government officials on their payroll and were able to negotiate situations in which they were paying little to no tax in the nations that they were operating in, and were granted various concessions, in relation to the land. So basically, they were getting land for little and nothing, and they could just invest in, building a railway because they really paid little or nothing for the land, and things like that were going on. And so this relationship now that was created between this multinational corporation and the governments in the nation that they were operating within created a situation of neo-colonialism, whereby the governmental policy, as far as economics is concerned, was being decided by and according to what was in the interest of, Chiquita, but this at this point is known as the United Fruit Company. Yeah. Going forward, little more in the history, just as an example of what we're dealing with here, in the year 1911, a number of the US-based fruit companies, because Chiquita wasn't the only one, but even some of the smaller ones, Chiquita was the biggest one, the United Fruit Company was the biggest one, and it even owned shares in some of the smaller ones, and so they were able to facilitate in 1911 the overthrow of the government in Honduras, and install a new one. And the point of this was to make sure that the government at the time granted favorable tax policy, tax break, tax exemption to the banana companies, and also ensure that they had access, unmitigated and free access to the natural resources in these nations. Now, all of this all of this, in the final degree, is backed by the US government. Yeah. And the US government invaded in the early 1900s, between 1903 and 1925, Honduras 7 times. Yeah. So we're seeing what is generally speaking referred to as neocolonialism and Western imperialism, brothers and sisters. All right, operating here. Yeah. So going further, a little more into the history, one of the most, if not the most infamous crimes committed by the United Fruit Company is the Banana Massacre in 1928. Cut a long story short, a group of United Fruit Company employees decide to go on strike, and they have a set of demands, and their demands are to stop the practice of hiring through subcontractors. Yeah, they wanted to be hired directly by the United Fruit Company, so as to get favorable negotiation, directly with the boss rather than through middlemen. All right. Mandatory collective insurance, compensation for work accidents. So if you were injured at work, the company held no liability for the fact that you were injured, which means that they could generate an environment whereby it was dangerous, for you to work for them, and they would have to face no recompense. All liability was on the part of the employees themselves. Hygienic dormitories and 6-day work weeks. So I've already said that oftentimes the United Fruit Company controlled the housing of those in their employ, and the housing was considered to be substandard. And the word here is used dormitories, which really is not housing in the stricter sense of the term. Dormitories, right? And then they're demanding, they're asking for a 6-day work week. Well, that means that they were working 7 days a week, brothers and sisters, in Colombia during this time. That's the first 4 demands. The 5th demand: increase in daily pay for workers who earn less than 100 pesos per month. So I've already spoken about the poor pay that they were receiving. 6, weekly wage. They want to get paid weekly as opposed to monthly. Abolition of office stores. These are the stores now that you know that are owned by the company, the United Fruit Company, and you have to buy from them. Abolition of payment through coupons rather than money, which I've already explained, and improvement of hospital services. This means that even the healthcare of the employees was controlled by the United Fruit Company. And it's estimated that 25,000 people went on strike, in the month of November of 1928. On the 5th and 6th of December, brothers and sisters, remember, I'm going to tell you, it says state capture. The Colombian government sends in hundreds of troops to shoot down the strikers, the workers. Some say they did so because the United States government had directly threatened to invade Colombia if they didn't bring the strike under heel. Some say that because the United Fruit Company was effectively in control of the government, it was in fact the United Fruit Company itself that gave the order for the troops to go in. There's all kinds of nuances. What is without doubt, however, is that the U.S. Embassy in Colombia was communicating with the U.S. government in Washington on behalf of the United Fruit Company and detailing the progress of the squashing of the strike based upon a favorable result in relation to the United Fruit Company, brothers and sisters. So this is Chiquita now 100 years ago in Colombia committing crimes. It's not a new situation, brothers and sisters. Make we go a little further. In the 1950s, now by this time, the United Fruit Company is in fact known as Chiquita. And Chiquita is a name because they got this marketing, strategy and advertising campaign that features a cartoon banana that is referred to as Chiquita. And the marketing campaign is so much of a success that they changed the name of the corporation from the United Fruit Company to Chiquita in the 1940s. Well, in Guatemala in the 1950s, over or nearly, in and around approximately 50% of the whole of the land of Guatemala is owned by Chiquita. And they own that land tax-free. This is a foreign corporation operating in another country whereby they own in and around 50% of the land and they don't pay any tax upon it. Any tax at all upon the land. So Guatemala in 1950 elects a new head of state, Jacobo Arbenz. And he attempts to redistribute the land. He has what is referred to as an agrarian reform legislation, and he wants to institute a new labor code that would effectively dispossess Chiquita of somewhere in the region of 40% of the land that they owned, partly because even though they owned much of this land, a lot of it they were not using. And so he wanted to redistribute the land that Chiquita was not using to the impoverished people in Guatemala. And one of the things that I neglected to say in relation to the Colombia example that I gave a minute ago is how they were able to justify the mowing down of these strikers was that they connected them to communism. They put out the propaganda that these were communists, operating in the nation, and therefore that justified mowing them down. Well, in the case of Jacobo Arbenz, in Guatemala, they did the same thing. But not only did they do the same thing, they fabricated a whole propaganda campaign. This is now the United Fruit Company, Chiquita, in cahoots with the American government, literally fabricated stories and letters and all kinds of different paraphernalia and arguments that would connect the new prime minister in Guatemala with Soviet Russia and the Eastern Bloc. And this justified now President Eisenhower, sending in the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to ferment discord within the nation and send in the troops, brothers and sisters. And so the CIA was sent in to overthrow Arbenz in 1954. So it's necessary to note these things, brothers and sisters, particularly those of us from the Caribbean, because many of our grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, were employed by the United Fruit Company. There is a significant Jamaican diaspora in places like Cuba and Costa Rica and Panama, and a significant driving force behind the migrations of our ancestors, brothers and sisters, and great-grandparents and grandparents was the United Fruit Company and employment in the United Fruit Company. All of this and all of this criminality was designed to maintain and sustain the interest of this American corporation in the Americas, the Caribbean, South and Central America. And so this is the environment that shapes the current economic realities and context and conditions of the Caribbean as we know it. the fact that Western, in this case, American, some companies with links to Europe, but mostly American domiciled corporations expanded throughout the region in order to monopolize the industry to supply and meet the demands of an American market. That's what's taking place here. And to a significant degree, our economies in the Caribbean today are structured along the lines of what is best and most beneficial for the American market and the corporations, the multinational corporations coming out of America. But as a Garveyite, I have to go into some Garveyite analysis where this thing is concerned, because you have to know, say, when you look at the fact that the United Fruit Company was trying deliberately to squash strike movements and governments that were not favorable to its interest, it also was involved as the eyes and ears of the American government, as an extension of the American establishment and American imperialism in the squashing and attacking of the Garvey movement in the Caribbean. We could go into some reasoning, yeah, so. We're going to read a few passages from the great and illuminating book, Race First, the ideological organizational struggles of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, as written by our great ancestor, Baba Tony Martin. He says, from Costa Rica, the post office department found itself being prodded into action by anti-Negro World coalition of the United Fruit Company and the British Consul and the Costa Rican authorities. Remember I told you, say, oftentimes the United Fruit Company controlled the postal system and commandeered the government. So what he's saying here is that the newspaper of the UNIA-ACL, the Negro World newspaper, yes, was being detrimentally affected by a coalition of the United Fruit Company, the British government, and the Costa Rican authorities. In September 1919, the Washington Council for the United Fruit Company wrote the Secretary of State and enclosed sample copies of the Negro World. Garvey's earlier sojourn in Costa Rica had evidently not been uneventful for the company. Remembered it clearly. What they're referring to there, what he's referring to there, is the fact that prior to the establishment of the UNIA-ACL, Papa Garvey had in fact been employed by the United Fruit Company brothers and sisters. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. He was a timekeeper and for the United Fruit Company, and was involved as a timekeeper in leading a strike on behalf of the workers for the United Fruit Company against the United Fruit Company. He had developed a newspaper called La Nación in Costa Rica at the time that was advocating on behalf of the workers, and as a result of that fact, was in fact deported, sent out of the country. Yes, this is between 1910 and 1912, brothers and sisters. Yeah, so Papa Garvey had a long history with the United Fruit Company, and they certainly remembered that at this time, is what Baba Tony Martin is telling us. The letter explained that Garvey left, let's quote, left Limon in 1912, that he is a typical Nazi Jamaican, and if allowed to go on as he had been doing, there is a possibility of his attempting to repeat the French experience in Haiti, unquote. So the people them, the colonizer them in America and in the American corporation were afraid of the fact that the UNIA-ACL would do to America and American corporations what our people in Haiti did to France. This was over 100 years previously. When our people in Haiti kick out the French and the British and the Spanish, they were afraid that the growth of this universal African nationalist movement would have a similar impact that would be detrimental to their economic interest in the country, in the region. Very, very interesting things are going around. Yes, sir. He reported too that the governor of Limon, with the agreement of the British consul, was planning to deport all those present at the next UNIA meeting. This is all in the name and in defense of the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company Council suggested, finally, that the Department of Justice assign its Secret Service to the case. The Department of Justice is being called upon by a multinational private corporation in order to act in its interest. Since the UNIA was inciting revolution and thereby violating the neutrality of countries at peace with the United States. Similar correspondence was received from Costa Rican officials who, after banning the Negro world, requested the New York Post Office not allow it to be mailed to Costa Rica. Yeah, neocolonialism are going around, yes, brothers and sisters. And so we're seeing this corporation now has been engaged in violence and sabotage for well over 100 years. Well, let's detail the history and put in the history in a Garveyite context, brothers and sisters, because the United Fruit Company came against the movement of Papa Garvey. Baba Tony Martin goes on. In Latin America, Department of State surveillance was supplemented by that of the United Fruit Company. So now the United Fruit Company is conducting surveillance throughout so-called Latin America on behalf of the US government. In January 1920, for example, Marie Duchatelier, writing from Panama City, where she was engaged on a promotional tour for the UNIA and Black Star Line, explained that the United Fruit Company had used its influence with the governments of Panama and the Canal Zone, bearing in mind that this is the time period now in which the American government is building the Panama Canal. Yes, to facilitate again its economic interests in the region. And so it has a number of different companies who stand to benefit from this arrangement, acting on its behalf. Another day we'll go into the conditions that the American government and its corporations subjected our people to during the building of the Panama Canal, and the atrocities that were committed during the building of the Panama Canal, and the numbers of people that died, African people that died building this canal to suit American political economic interests, brothers and sisters. But that's another story for another time. She explained that the United Fruit Company had used its influence with the governments of Panama and the Canal Zone to try to prevent the UNIA delegation from landing. She reported that the local blacks, together with the West Indians and led by a radical Spanish Panamanian, Morales, forced the hand of the authorities by threatening to strike on the canal and burn it down. And burn down the city of Colon. So in order to allow the UNIA to land, brothers and sisters, the people about to threaten to burn down the place. More fire if you don't allow the UNIA to land and come speak to it and give a Negro World newspaper and etc., etc., etc. The company also kept a check on occasion of monies remitted by its workmen to Garvey's organization. Such information was turned over to the local United States consul. So they had the UNIA-ACL under surveillance, and even the money of its employees in relation to the UNIA-ACL under surveillance, brothers and sisters. But why? Why was all of this necessary? Baba Tony Martin informs us there was little about Garvey's program that could not be construed as a threat, direct or indirect, to the United States. His doctrines of militant racial struggle could sometimes be transferred into strikes against such powerful United States corporations as the United Fruit Company in several Latin American countries. Yes, indeed, it is documented that the UNIA-ACL, members of it, and those who were inspired by it were leaders of strikes against the United Fruit Company all throughout the Americas. His African program, too, with its anti-imperialist and nationalistic implications, would, if successful, augur ill for American financial interests. Garvey took the position that American capital would seek to expand its influence in Africa. In 1929, he wrote, quote, "Europe today is bankrupt and cannot advance much capital for the development of African industries, and therefore they are trying to interest American capitalists in the exploitation of the wealth of the great continent." We just outlined in the fact that these people considered the movement of the UNIACL to be a great threat to their economic interests. And so when we see the headline right here now, banana giant held liable for funding paramilitaries, banana giant held liable for funding paramilitaries, we have to know, say, this particular banana giant has a long history of violence, robbery, theft, murder, pillaging, rape, and exploitation of African people and others throughout South Central America and the Caribbean. And that's why, even though the winning of this case is significant in relation to the families, and may they get everything what them deserve, when we look at the bigger picture, we know that this conviction is but a very small part of a whole bigger story that Chiquita, the United Fruit Company, Dole, and any number of other American corporations in the regions will never be brought to full justice for the crimes that they have committed. We also have to take note, brothers and sisters, that a strong universal African nationalist movement among African people is a direct threat to the interests of these corporations and these governments. And so if we want to truly serve the needs of our people, we all have a responsibility to build such a movement, brothers and sisters, and do right and just by the masses of our people around the world. That concludes our geopolitical analysis for today, brothers and sisters. We'll be back with more geopolitical analysis, and in particular, how this all relates to the great nation of Haiti in future installments. With that, we say Tendai Mwari. We thankful unto the Mother, Father, Creative Life Force of the universe. Kudzai, Mudzimu Mokodo. We give praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tomi, Abibi Fahodiye, African power and African liberation for all African people. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe.